In this episode of the podcast, I'm really glad to be joined by Maren Birkby. Maren runs a company called Sell Smoothly, and she's using her experience in working with startup founders and business owners to help with the process of developing sales capability within businesses. Maren, it's great to have you here. Thanks for being on the podcast. I know you've worked with founders in lots of different capacities, and you've helped them to start and grow and expand overseas. And you're now working with founders, helping them with sales, as well as many other types of business owners and professionals. I'm really interested in the why of why you're doing this, because I think you and I understand some of the challenges that founders and, technical domain experts face when it comes to sales. But I'm really interested to hear your perspective on, why sales is such a big challenge for some of these business owners.
Yeah, thanks, Colin, for having me, first of all. Well, sales makes the business go around, right? We wouldn't have a business if we don't have sales. And in my work over the last 25 years, working across marketing and sales, I've come to recognize how much founders and businesses are struggling with sales, particularly in Australia. And it's something I want to change. I've been working with startups for the last 5 years, and I see businesses fail all the time because they don't have a clear sales process in place. And that's why I'm passionate in coming in and helping.
So how much of it is process and how much it is mindset or, other psychological barriers? Because I know in the work I do with startup founders, particularly at an early stage, you see often a reluctance, particularly among technical founders or people who like to kind of build the product. There's a real reluctance, it seems, to kind of go from building the product to selling the product. Is that kind of the challenge that you're mostly trying to help these founders address?
Yeah, absolutely. What it comes down to 99% of the time is clarity. Founders have a lack of clarity. They think they have a problem with sales when they have a problem in a clear approach. So their ICP is fuzzy, their messaging is vague, their positioning is unclear. And when you work in those parameters, you are selling confusion. You're not selling an actual solution to a pain point that someone is feeling.
Yeah. So clarity is difficult. You mentioned ICP. We should jargon bust. What's an ICP, and how do startup founders understand who their ICP is?
An ICP is an ideal customer profile. So this is the best customer that you could possibly sell to. And mapping out clearly who that is going to set the foundation for the rest of your sales process. So what we're looking at is what role do they hold in a specific company if we're selling B2B, what triggers them to purchase, what are their interests, their psychographic metrics, where do they consume most of their content, where do they learn about new products or processes, what keeps them up at night, what needs do they have, how do they like to be engaged with. So those mapping out all of those parameters helps us then formulate what our sales process should look like and how we can reach that audience.
So when you work with startup founders, what do you typically see in terms of, where they're at with developing sales process and mindset? Like, are they usually in a reasonable shape or not?
Founders need to stop listening to sales advice from large markets like the US without applying a cultural filter to it. Australians don't like being sold to. We're very different cultural profile than Americans are. And we need a sales approach that is culturally aligned. And without recognizing that founders are trying all these different sales approaches, they hustle hard, they work in a persuasive approach, they resort to direct sales because that's the advice that they've consumed. And that advice works in a large market like the US, but it doesn't necessarily work in Australia. So where many founders go wrong is they don't apply a cultural filter to their approach, in addition to lacking that clarity that I mentioned at the start. And what happens is they feel inauthentic in how they come across. They fear of being rejected, and everything goes pear-shaped from there. So my advice is start with the clarity. Be really clear who you're selling to, what your message is, and how you're positioning yourself in the market. The more specific you are, the more niche you are, the more your message and your positioning will resonate with your audience. And then you apply that cultural filter and be a human in our sales process. We have to talk from Australians to Australians in order to sell successfully.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I see this quite a lot with founders who, like you say, if they look at the US market or they look at kind of other cultures, they get a bit of a cringe and they think, oh, I don't know if that's really what I want to do. And sometimes what happens is founders seem to then withdraw from sales. They kind of go, I'll just build more product, or I'll let someone else in my team handle sales. But if you're a founder, like at least in the early days, tell me if you agree with this, but it seems to me like a lot of founders really ought to be and have to be the kind of lead of the sales process because it's their company, it's their product, it's their vision. They're going to be able to have that authentic conversation with potential customers better than anyone else, and at least for a few years. Is that your experience?
Absolutely. Founders fail when they try to outsource the sales process too early. Mm-hmm. Without having a clear idea of what your win pattern looks like, what your buying journey looks like, and what your sales narrative is, all you do is outsourcing confusion. And this is what I'm seeing all the time is founders that struggle with sales. They try to bring in the magician salesperson that invents a sales process that they were never able to map out clearly. And that doesn't work. What needs to happen is they need to be able to document their own sales process. The discipline that they bring to the table through sales, because that's really all sales is, it's a discipline. And once they have a process in place, they don't need a magician anymore in the team. They can use an average salesperson that can repeat that process and scale the business based on the existing process that's in place.
Makes sense. So this podcast is part of our Female Founders program, which is funded by the Queensland Government. And as you know, we're working with a large number of female founders all around Queensland, helping them get started. Are there any particular challenges that you see when you work with female founders that are different to the sales challenges faced by male founders?
Interestingly, female founders are less used to getting rejected in life in general. Males from a young age have gotten used to getting rejected and build up a bit of a thick skin in that sense. Women tend to not have that prior experience or exposure to rejection. So women often struggle a little bit more with the sales approach. And it comes down to fear of rejection, fear of coming across inauthentic. At the same time, though, women often find it easier to build up that rapport, be a little bit more in tune, listen, have that empathy, that nurturing that resonates really, really well in the Australian market. So in Australia, a consultative sales approach is what works, where we lead with really diagnosing what's wrong, what's the pain point of the customer, what's keeping them up at night, and asking really deliberate questions and listening actively. And that's often, not always, but very often, a strength that comes more easily to women.
That's interesting. I want to delve into that a bit more, particularly what you said before about asking questions and then listening, because I think a lot of people find that their attitude towards sales is, all right, I've got to go in and pitch my product or service, whatever it is I'm offering. But actually, sales is mostly about listening. So, can you just talk through how you work with founders and other people who are in that kind of transition into becoming competent at sales? And is that do you have to coach them through asking questions and then tell them to zip it, or how does that work?
It's definitely an approach and a principle behind sales and listening. What I'm teaching in the Smoothly methodology is to show up or see yourself as a surgeon. And a surgeon asks very specific questions, listens, asks further follow-up questions, and only when they're really, really clear on the problem at hand is when they come with a recommendation or a prescription of some sort. And a specialist of that kind is also willing to say, sorry, this is not a fit. My solution is not going to fix the problem that you're showing up with. And bringing that mindset to the table in any sales conversation then positions us no longer as the pushy salesperson. It positions us as the expert that guides the prospect through their own buying journey. And that's what many get wrong, is really understanding that there is a psychological process that takes place in anyone wanting to buy anything. We first need to be aware that there is a problem at hand and that there is an urgency to take action to solve this problem. Then we evaluate the solution, we evaluate the provider, and only then are we able to commit to any pitch that has been presented to us. The mistake many founders are making is they're pitching too early. They lead with the sale, they lead with the pitch when they haven't actually verified that there is a problem worth solving or a problem that they are able to solve with their solution.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it's like a triage process in a way that says, well, is this even a potential customer? And if not, well, we can all move on and find the next one.
Absolutely. And many founders are wasting times on deals that are not worth pursuing because there's no problem that needs to be solved, or their product or solution isn't the right fit for that problem. So founders disqualifying or not disqualifying fast enough is as much of an issue as founders qualifying or not qualifying fast enough.
Yeah, for sure. And I can imagine that would then flow into the kind of motivational stuff that says, well, all right, I've talked to, 10 potential customers and all 10 of them said, they're not interested. And that's hard. Like, I mean, everyone finds that, lots of rejection is hard. But maybe part of that is that people are talking to the wrong potential customers, or pursuing them beyond the point where they could have established that, what we have doesn't solve their problem. Let's move on.
Absolutely. And the importance of detaching from the product or the business that you're building and understanding that rejection is not something to be taken personal. Rejection is data. It's really just feedback. And what we do with that feedback really decides whether we thrive or our business dies. So if we take that data, and to your point, understand that, hey, maybe we're marketing to the wrong person, or maybe the problem that I think I'm solving is actually not really a big enough problem for most people. When we take that data and we really look at it objectively, then we come out as bigger and stronger founders and businesses.
Yeah. Do you have any practical tips for people getting better at dealing with rejection? Because, I mean, even if you've got a product that's fantastic and it solves a real problem for your customer, nobody has a 100% success rate. That just doesn't happen. So are there things that you help founders to do to kind of overcome that fear of rejection and be able to treat it as, like you say, a data point rather than, criticism?
Yeah, I think the very first starting point is understanding that you separate yourself from the product you're selling. Like, really visualize yourself wearing a different hat when you are in a sales call or a discovery call or any type of conversation. It doesn't even need to be the full sales pitch. In any conversation, you're wearing a hat when you're representing your business. So that is sort of the first shield that you're putting around yourself, like a little protection to make sure that nothing sort of reaches you on a too personal level. Secondly, it's the reality of understanding that sometimes you need to hear 100 no's before you get one yes, and that's okay. And especially at the start of your journey, you have to throw things against the wall and see what sticks. And that involves getting a lot of no's. And that's okay. It's all data. And we have to have that resilience to deal with that.
Yeah, it's so important. I was reading about what Y Combinator, so the Silicon Valley startup accelerator that I know you know well, what they do with startup founders who are not from a sales background and struggle a bit with the mindset part of it, is they actually they set them an exercise where they say, go and get rejected 20 times. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be, if you're getting on a plane, go up to the desk and say, can you please upgrade me to business class? And most of the time they're going to say, no, we can't do that. So literally they just say, look, go and get practice at being rejected for things. And that helps people to kind of go, oh, it's okay. I'm still here. I got rejected all those times, and it's almost like just getting them familiar with that kind of feeling, and then moving on and saying, well, it's okay, no big deal. I don't know if do you do anything like that?
Oh, on a personal level, for sure. Like, I think it's definitely a muscle that we need to flex and grow. And especially, like I said, especially as women, like we get way less rejected than men do. So we just haven't had that practice level, I guess, as we go through life. So I think those opportunities are really fantastic ways to understand that rejection is just what it is, and a no is only just a no. I often say to my kids, like, you have to ask, and the worst thing that can happen is that you know, like, but imagine on the flip side, the upside of what it means to get a yes. So I think not letting go of the positive thinking and thinking upside versus downside. And the worst that can happen is it's a no. The best that can happen, or imagine it's a yes. So that's what we need to aim for.
Yeah, for sure. No, that makes good sense. What about this transition? You've touched on this before, this transition that founders need to make from doing customer discovery to actually moving into sales. And I see this a lot with Startup Onramp, as you know, focuses on working with early stage founders that are typically pre-launch or maybe just recently launched. And it's actually quite a difficult challenge for a lot of founders to make, is to say, well, my initial goal was to understand the customer. I've done a bunch of discovery interviews, maybe done some, surveys and other things, maybe run some experiments. That kind of, for a lot of founders, seems to be comfortable because they kind of go, oh, I'm just doing interviews. What's your advice for founders on then making that transition? How do they know when's the right time to transition and start actually selling? And are there any things that they can do to kind of make that a smooth transition?
I think you know when you're ready to sell. I think you know when you've listened to your customers, you've ran your interviews, you get that feedback from your focus group, whoever you run your ideas by. Obviously, you need a product, you need a minimum viable product, you need something to sell. I think often we overcomplicate that and we strive for perfection. We think we have to have the complete bells and whistles and everything attached. I think understanding that sometimes we build products as we go along, and having the bravery and the courage to sell a product that is maybe not yet clearly defined, and allowing ourselves to redefine and reiterate that product as we go through that sales process. So I guess that is one thing, is really start selling, see what sticks, have those conversations. At the same time, like I said before, don't start with the pitch. Don't come in with the solution. Really listen, diagnose, understand what they need, because even that is data. If you're talking to 10 potential customers and 8 of them are describing a problem that you're not solving, or they're describing a completely different pain point to what you have on your radar, then you might need to tweak your ideal customer profile. So it is really all data, and it's all clarity, and clarity precedes confidence. When we do something consistently enough and we have a certain clarity on how we're doing things, that's how we build confidence. Another tip I often give early stage founders when they look at landing their first sale is consistency beats creativity. You don't have to have, you know, really fancy advertising or certain ways of doing things. Just do it consistently. Just
Right.
show up every day. Have a certain plan in mind. I'm going to reach out to 20 customers this week, no matter what. No matter what response I'm getting, I'm reaching out to 20 customers. Build that sales discipline. That's really what it comes down to. If you rely on motivation for your sales, you're going to fail. Sales is a discipline that thrives through consistency. That consistency and the feedback that you're receiving throughout and the refinement that you can apply to your sales process will then help you map out what works and what doesn't. And that's how you then scale. That's how you eventually will be able to hand over that founder-led approach to a sales team by knowing exactly what your business needs and what brings in the revenue.
That makes a lot of sense. And I actually see a lot of founders that don't do that. They don't kind of say, I'm going to, I mean, even just the simple thing of committing some time in their calendar each week to say, this is my kind of, sales or business development block of time. And, what invariably happens is, what founders are like, that you got 100 things to deal with all the time. And so it's the kind of eat the frog phenomenon. If sales is something that doesn't come naturally or you're a bit, reluctant to do it for whatever reason, it kind of gets pushed down the priority list. So I find that, just putting things in people's calendars helps. Like they need to be able to say, right, Monday mornings and Wednesdays or whatever, like that's dedicated to sales.
Absolutely. Another number one pitfall is follow-up. The number of founders I work with that struggle with follow-up. They don't want to be that pushy person. They don't want to bug people and continuously reach out through email or direct messages. But the statistics show that sales really happen after 2 to 3 follow-ups. But most founders don't even follow up once. So just by simply introducing a routine, like you said, schedule it in your calendar. I'm doing a follow-up. I've sent out this email on Monday. By Wednesday, I'm going to check in with that customer. And just by introducing a follow-up routine, you'll be surprised how much your sales process will thrive from that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about processes to support that? Do you recommend, particularly for early stage companies, do you recommend like a spreadsheet that just tracks prospects and keep it really simple? Do you use a CRM? What do you think generally is the best way for early stage companies to go?
It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be a fancy tool to track your pipeline. The importance is that you use it consistently. It can be a CRM program, it can be a spreadsheet, it can be built in a Notion page. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that you track what's happening on each stage of your approach. It's important that your different CRM stages are mapped to the actual buying journey so that you're not following internal processes to guide the buyer from one stage to the next. You're actually aligned with what they need at their decision-making phase.
Yeah.
So yeah, it doesn't have to be a fancy tool, because you can have the fanciest tools if your discipline is messy. You'll just have a very fancy tool with a messy discipline, so it's not going to help much.
Yeah, for sure. No, that aligns with what I see in the work I do with founders. And I actually see a lot of the time founders, particularly if it's a B2B, long, time frame enterprise sale, they'll kind of lose track of the early conversation that they had maybe a month ago, and they kind of go, well, I didn't hear back from that, company, therefore it's a no. And sometimes I say to them, well, how do you know it's a no? Like, have they said no, or have they just not replied? Because like people get really busy, and I think, that's part of the discipline thing that you're talking about earlier, I guess, that they need to have that kind of rigor that says, well, until I get either a yes or a no, I should assume that it could be a yes.
Absolutely. People don't respond for all sorts of reasons. People are busy, other things take priority. It's really important to make that a routine. I also talk about the importance, though, to be really intentional with your follow-up. Avoid emails that are, hey, just checking in, or I'm bumping this on to the top of your inbox. Like, have a reason why you're following up. And that's why listening at the start of the discovery is so important, because that's what you tie your follow-up back to. So the follow-up then doesn't become, hey, Sarah, I'm just following up on the quote I sent you. The follow-up then becomes, hey, Sarah, I'm just wondering if you're still interested in solving the churn problem that you're having in your business. So
Makes a
we
big
really
difference.
touch it. Absolutely. And Sarah is now reminded, oh, that's right. That's why I was working with Maren. I'm really want to solve this massive churn issue that I have in my business. Otherwise, my business is not going so well. So you're reminding your customer what's at stake, and you're reminding them of the pain point.
We've touched on this, but I want to get your advice for founders that are scaling. So if a founder has done kind of founder-led sales and they've got some early traction and, they've got good relationships with their early customers, good problem to have, I guess. But, at some point that has to stop. The founder probably is going to move into more of a classic CEO role, where they run the business and they have a team of people that do sales. What's your advice for founders who are making that transition or getting to the point where they realize they need to make that transition into, handing off responsibility for sales to other people?
Hiring a salesperson too early is one of the most expensive mistakes that you can make as a founder. At the start of your business, for a certain period of time, you will be the best salesperson that the business can see, because you know your product intensely. You know exactly what the benefits are and the value that you provide. You have the networks, you have the passion, you can answer all the questions. No one will throw themselves as much into the business as you are. But there will be a time when you want to scale the business. And if you hold on to sales, then your business growth will be limited to the capacity that you bring to the table. So what the founder has to do in order to be successful with that is to map out the sales process to the point where a clear customer persona exists, the buying journey is mapped out, and value proposition and positioning are crystal clear. And when those things exist and a sales process has been documented, then that can be repeated by a sales team of however number of people that you want to hire. But without that in place, without that foundation, all that you're outsourcing is confusion, and you will scale chaos.
Yeah, I think you and I have probably seen this multiple times where founders kind of go, I'm done with sales. I'm just going to hire a salesperson. And they just drop that person into business and hope that they'll figure it out.
Absolutely. It's one of the most common things I see founders do, especially when they reach a certain maturity or they raise capital. The first thing they want to do is put in a salesperson, because the founder's too busy to sell, and I never really liked selling that much. So the most obvious thing is to outsource that to someone else. You don't scale revenue by adding people, you scale it by removing ambiguity. And the amount of times founders go through one salesperson after another, it's not the salesperson that is bad or doing a job poorly. It's the system that's flawed. And what we need to install is a system that makes average people effective. I'm a strong advocate of the culture in sales and understanding that sales have to be culturally aligned. I work with founders who are ambitious to scale into the UK and into the US. So one conversation that we have is the importance of understanding that sales look differently in those other markets. And I know your audience is mostly quite early stage, but there often comes a time where the Australian market feels limited and founders do look overseas to scale their business. So understanding what the differences are between the US or the UK or Australia is really, really important. So as a short summary, buyer expectations are very different in the US. Like in the US, decisions are made really fast. There's a high tolerance for bold claims. There is a really strong focus on return on investment and outcomes, and buyers are risk takers. I've had one founder tell me that when she attended a conference in the US, the number of people that walked up to her and almost waved the credit card at her and said, where can I swipe? I want to buy right now. That's almost unheard of in a market like Australia. And then the UK is probably even more conservative than us, and even more relationship driven than Australia, more skeptical, and decisions take place even slower and are more consensus based. So where founders often go wrong is copying messaging in our sales approach across different markets when they need to be different.
If you had one piece of advice for early stage founders that recognize they need to get better at sales, what would it be?
Put in the time and effort and use the amazing tools, AI tools that we have these days at our fingertips to really drill down on who you're selling to, why they care about your product, why they should care, what your messaging is, and be really specific. It takes courage to say no to people that might be willing to buy from you, especially when you're in an early stage. But the more specific you are and the more niche you go, the more your message and your sales will resonate with your buying audience, and the more likely you are going to convert. So practicing narrowing down the net that you're casting out into the masses and gone really specific. What specific segment am I looking to sell to? And I will guarantee that your conversion rates will show the difference.
That's really solid advice. I like that.
Number one asset that I recommend founders have as an internal asset is an objection handling cheat sheet.
Okay.
Sure, website, LinkedIn profile, social media, all of that, standard thing, right? We have to have that in place. What many founders don't have in place is a bit of firstly, an internal documentation of how do I sell and what is my process. But an objection handling cheat sheet is extremely useful because that's where we often get tripped up and we get caught off guard, and then we justify our pricing, or even worse, we discount too early. We completely change our entire product around because we feel that is a rejection when really, in fact, it's an objection. So understanding how to handle objections and sitting down, really jotting down what are the 4 or 5 top objections that I'm hearing when I'm talking to a prospect, and how can I reframe those? How can I use those objections to position myself in the market with that particular prospect and really use that to emphasize the value that I'm bringing to the table? So, for example, if price is the objection, I work with a 4-step framework. We acknowledge the objection. Yeah, sure, fair enough. Absolute price matters. We then clarify the objection, but just so I understand, are you worried about the overall cost of ownership, or are you just worried about the monthly sign up? The third step is reframing the objection. Well, yes, I know we're not the cheapest in the market, but our solution is proven to save 50% of time, which means you're completing projects early and you're saving a ton on human resources on the other end. And the 4th step is then to reduce risk. So we provide some asset or artifact or an offering that reduces the risk for the buyer, whether that's a free trial, 7 weeks without payment, or it's a testimonial, a case study, whatever that may be. But having something like that mapped out for your core 4 or 5 objections is a really handy tool to have. And before you know it, you would have memorized them and objections will be handled much more naturally from there on.
Yeah, that's really useful. And I see a lot of founders increasingly using Claude or ChatGPT to act as the kind of role play, act as the customer and ask them those kind of objection related questions. And I'm not sure if it's quite there yet. There are actually some AI tools that are very focused on this kind of role playing thing. I think it's a really interesting opportunity to help founders have that kind of safe practicing experience. We actually do it in our founder community where we get people to deliver a pitch, whether it's a customer pitch or an investor pitch or whatever, just among their peers to get that kind of safe feedback to say, well, all right, I'll ask you some devil's advocate questions and see where it gets to. So I guess it's just what you're saying before, isn't it? It's practice and getting comfortable with dealing with objections.
Absolutely. And using objections to your advantage by surfacing objections earlier. So intentionally asking questions early in the discovery process to really understand what's driving the prospect, but also to understand what objections could be showing up later in the process. And this becomes particularly important for B2B sales where sales cycles are extremely long. And I'm sure there's many founders listening right now that have been working with an organization or a new enterprise they're trying to onboard. And 3 months into the process, someone else joins the conversation and procurement now has all of these questions around specs or provider suitability, etc. If those objections can be surfaced earlier, then we can shorten those sales cycles, and we all know what that means for our revenue.